everyone, it's I, Wacky Anime What If here to present you with What If Deku Was a Bioweapon Part 1. And I hope you all enjoy. But before we get into this, have you heard I have a second second channel. It's a gaming channel known as Midnight Psycho. If you want me to play any games, I'll always put it in the poll on this channel. And I'll always play it on the next channel, my second channel, Midnight Psycho. But it might take a delay since I'm mainly focusing on my what ifs nowadays. So let's go ahead and get into this. What if Deku was a bioweapon, Part 1? Midoriya, he did not have a wonderful life. But it got worse at the age of 5. When Midoriya was at the age of 5, he was walking towards his mother, which his mother was in the lab still. She was messing with some chemicals, and she was muttering, "I don't have enough test subjects. These damn heroes." And Midoriya didn't know what she meant by that. The heroes are doing a wonderful job getting out the villains. He even saw on the news that they were hunting down this corporation called the Umbrella Corporation, with some new heroes like Leon, Chris, and Jill. And they were doing miracle work, in Midoriya's opinion, but his mother really never liked heroes, so he never told her his aspiration to become a hero. But today he was getting his quirk and he was excited, so he rushed up to his mother who was in the lab and hugged her. And once he did this, Inko snapped and slapped him in the face and pushed him down on the ground and said, "Don't you ever touch me, you damn failure." And Midoriya was confused why she's acting like this. And her eyes were that of desperation, that of anger, and just a person who owns nothing, who has nothing left. She was not like this when she was a little younger. When he was the age of 3, she wasn't like this. But after the years started going, she was desperate for some reason. He didn't understand why. He thought it was financial problems, but no, they lived in a underground place. He never really noticed where this place was because whenever he was leaving the place, she always put a blindfold over his face, over his eyes, whenever he was taken out. He thought it was weird at first, but he got used to it. And once he ever tried to ask if she wanted to play with him or if she could spend some time with him, he started getting beaten, so he stopped really asking his mother to spend time with him because he was scared of being beaten or brutally beaten, whipped, chained, or being starved for weeks on end without food. He was terrified of this. He was more terrified of his mother than anything. But the only reason why he asked to go to the quirk doctor was because he wants to become a hero. He wants to leave this house. He wants to have a life of his own. He aspires for this. Even though he's only the age of 5, if he could train his quirk, then he can manage to become a hero. One, he would always protect other people. And other people that were in abusive situations like this, he would not turn a blind eye to anyone that's hurt. Especially other children like himself. This is the reason why he pestered her. And he continued pestering her while he was being beaten up by her. He was brutally being punched in the guts, the face, being lifted up and choked in the air, and slammed into her desk. And her facility all around was a very big room. And there were chemicals everywhere. There were desks everywhere. And there were chairs, metal chairs everywhere else too, under the desks. And Midoriya is being slammed into the desk and being beaten by the chair currently. It's unbearably painful for him, but he's already endured other pain, so he just merely keeps on asking while he's being beaten, until she finally gives up and runs out of stamina and takes Midoriya to the quirk doctor, after getting him fixed up with some bandages, and tells him to say that he tripped down the stairs. If you say anything else, then you'll be punished. And Midoriya nods his head before he follows his mother into the vehicle and has to put on a blindfold. And she starts driving while telling Midoriya that he's useless. He'll never become anything, and even if he has a good quirk, he's too stupid to understand the value of his quirk. Or he'll have some weak quirk and you'll probably just be ostracized like I am. She screams and she just starts desperately clawing at Midoriya in the back seat while driving to get her hands on him just to relieve her own stress of her situation. And Midoriya is always scared of his mother, especially when they go out to places or whenever they talk about quirks in particular, because he knows his mother has a weak psychic quirk and she's been bullied her whole life because of this. And she said she couldn't become anything. She became a scientist, though, just to prove people wrong, that she could become something even with a weak quirk, which he thought was really noble. But he doesn't know exactly what her job really is and how badly his life is going to go from the moment he enters the quirk doctor's office. Once he's driven all the way to the quirk doctor's office and walks in, he sees all the children waiting in excitement for their quirks, and he joins them and starts jumping up and down before Inko slaps him in the face and says, "Calm down, you little brat," and screams that. Everyone looks at her, and she immediately just looks at them and glares and says, "What are you guys looking at? I'm educating my son." And they merely scowl at her and tell her, "This is not how you treat your son. You don't beat him like that. You just pull him to his side and just tell him that not to be that excited if you were annoyed by that." And she merely says, "Who are you to tell me how to raise my damn son?" He says it's the 5 women that said this. And one Mitsuki Bakugo walked towards... one Mitsuki Katsuki walks up towards her and says, "You're an awful mother. I can tell. I can see those markings on him. And these bandages," while she's assessing Midoriya. And she merely says, "He just tripped down the stairs. The foolish klutz tripped down the stairs, that's all." And he just says, I tripped." As soon as Mitsuki looks at him and asks, "What happened? Did she do this to you?" And he says, I tripped. It was nothing." Out of fear of retaliation from his mother. And he didn't want his mother to pull out the tools again. Or to pull out his... fingernails again. Because she always did such things. Pull out his fingernails, dig into his skin. But she always injected him with a chemical that would always make it to where he regenerated quicker for a few hours. It was quite odd. And it was very terrifying. Because it never left any scars. The scars would regenerate after a while from those chemicals that were injected into him. He doesn't have any regeneration currently because it's a time-limited regeneration. The moment you take the medicine, you can regenerate for an hour as quickly as possible, but you lose your motor functions for 2 hours after, which is what he's always injected with every day, just because she beats on him every day and leaves marks on him. There's one time where she ends up chopping off his ears and saying, "You don't listen in the first place, so what's the point of having them? They're just decoration." And this made Midoriya fear her more, because no matter what happens, if there's no marks or anything to prove that he was being beaten on, then the authorities would just, say nothing happened at all. Or that he was making it up and it was just a child's imagination. So he knew not to say anything to Mitsuki. And Mitsuki just looked at him and just walked away, very depressed, seeing this young child going through this, but knowing she couldn't do a thing if the child didn't admit to it. While everyone was being called, Bakugo Katsuki was called, and Midoriya looked at Bakugo Katsuki, who was beside his mother, which he noted as a kind woman, and he merely looked at Midoriya, smiled, and waved, and said, "I hope you have a good quirk. Also, it's nice to meet you. He walked up towards Midoriya and said this, because Midoriya knew Bakugo for a little bit since he was 3. He was in the kindergarten for a little before he was pulled out by his mother. He was kind of friends with Bakugo Katsuki, and he wanted to stay that way before he was pulled out, but he never really interacted with him much, and he kind of thought that Bakugo forgot him. But he didn't. This made him happy. He smiled a big grin until he felt a really intimidating glare at him, and he looked up and saw his mother staring at him with fire in her eyes, and just her eyes said, "You're happy? You don't deserve such happiness." Before they'd be called in next, after Bakugo walked out and said that his actual quirk was called Explosions, that he hopes Midoriya gets a good quirk as well. Once Midoriya walked in, he was asked to follow the doctor in the back room. Once he went to the back room, the doctor looked at him up and down and asked, "Have you been feeling different any lately?" And Midoriya said, "Not particularly. Have you had any changes? Have you showed any signs of anything bizarre?" And Midoriya ends up saying, "No, I haven't showed any signs of anything like that." And he says, "I'm going to run some tests on you currently." He ends up doing some x-rays, doing some reflex tests, and dropping some stuff in front of him to see if he has a fast reflex time or anything. And through the various tests, he doesn't really do anything well. He doesn't do anything that's above average, and his actual pinky toe has 2 joints. The doctor immediately walks out with Midoriya and looks up towards Inko and says, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but it seems like your son is quirkless." And once these words leave out of his mouth, he wishes he wouldn't have said that, because he sees this woman known as Inko Midoriya walk up towards Midoriya, pick him up by the head, lift him up in the air, and start slapping him insanely fast and hard in the face, causing marks all over him, and does it over and over and over, right in front of the doctor. And the doctor says, "Ma'am, you can't do that to your son." And she looks at him and says, "I don't have a damn son. This is just some wild animal. Is there a law to say that I can't beat animals? Is there a law to say that I can't kill an animal? Everyone kills animals for fun, or for the hunt. So I can't just kill this one and put it out of its misery," is what she says. And she looks at him with scorn. Scorn that he's never seen from his mother. He's seen little scorn, and maybe a little bit abuse. Well, more than a little bit. But he's never seen his mother glare at him like this, like insignificant trash. She always had some type of kindness, even though it was distorted. But no, all that seems like it was snuffed out already. Because she personally thought he was just going to have a weak quirk or something. But no, he had no quirk. None at all. And this made her infuriated, because he's even more powerless than she was. And she sees herself in Midoriya, which makes her angry. She then takes Midoriya out of the room and runs out and throws him to the back of the car in the trunk and just bops him on the head as hard as possible, punches him in the skull very hard, and Midoriya is knocked out. And she notices that electricity came out of her hand when he was punched. And before she blacks out, he thinks, "Wasn't my mother's quirk... Wasn't it telekinesis? How did lightning come out before his eyes closed?" And next thing you know, he wakes up a few hours later, and he's strapped to a chair, and he sees doctors all around him gathered with this weird logo on their coats that has an umbrella. And he knows what that is from all the time when he was watching TV about heroes. It's a corporation called the Umbrella Corporation. They caught him. Wait, he remembers being with his mom before. And then he hears a familiar voice over the intercom. "Begin the experiment with 001. And it was his mother over the intercom. And he's starting to piece it together. His mother has been working with these villains. He always thought she was just abusive, He didn't think she was just a villain or a researcher working for a villain corporation. But little does he know, until now, that she isn't just a normal corporation member. As everyone addresses the intercom voice and says, "We'll do our best, Founder." And right when Midoriya is starting to process what's happening around him, he feels intense pain into his chest. They pull out drills. They're drilling into his skin. They're injecting chemicals through him, through these tubes that are going into his flesh, his back, his eyes, his head. There are tubes going all throughout all of the flesh in his body, and they're injecting tons and tons of chemicals. There are 5 tons of chemicals right behind him being injected into him. He's wiggling and trying to get out of the chair, but he's strapped too tight. And then all the scientists are stabbing into him, injecting all of the viruses they can, all of the T-virus variants, all of it. They're also putting in the DNA of a nemesis, the DNA of Leon, and they also put in the DNA of someone known as Wesker. Which, the way that they got Wesker's DNA was because Wesker and Leon had a confrontation a few years back, and Wesker was trying to inject himself with a certain virus to make himself immortal. That was his goal. Make himself immortal so his plans will never be stopped, because he could never be stopped. He was very strong on his own, but he wanted to become stronger. Once he injected himself with it, he didn't know that a certain chemical reaction with his physique, with his ability to turn it into mist, it's caused him to explode from the inside, because the mist and the particles that were inside of the chemicals, they did not mix well. They caused him to explode in front of Leon, thus saying that he committed suicide. But they managed to get some fresh samples from that, and Leon got something out of it too, but that'll be explained later. That's how they got the Wesker sample, his blood, from the explosion. They injected all of this into Midoriya, and they put him into a Tubix tank after all this happened, and after they tested out his regeneration by drilling into him, right after the injections were done. And his regeneration was quite fascinating. They managed to rip out all of his fingernails, and they grew almost immediately back. After about 2 minutes, they grew back. They ripped off his whole hand, and it took 5 minutes for it to grow back. And then they decided to rip off, well, his whole legs, both of the legs, just to see if they would regenerate quicker. And they actually regenerated about 5 minutes. They tested out this by ripping off each of his limbs or removing them. Smaller limbs take 2 minutes, bigger limbs take 5 minutes to regenerate, which they figured they could increase the time period they would take to regenerate, or decrease the time, by injecting with more chemicals. So for over 10 years, he's been experimented on. He's been drilled into, he's been hung from places, crucified. They tried to kill him in any way to see if he could die. They found out the only way that he can personally die is if someone were to rip out his heart or remove his brain. And they have to crush either of those. They can't just remove it, they have to crush his brain or crush his heart. Those are the only ways to actually kill him. You could behead him and it won't really kill him. His head will just regenerate back. And you'll just be left with a severed head and your hand, which they found quite fascinating. He's really different from all the other bioweapon failures they made. He was quite a really interesting sample. The words of Inka Midoriya said. He was experimented on until the age of 15. Once he was 15, he was released from the tank that he was submerged in with all the chemicals, and once he got out, they'd always torture him, just to see how far his abilities go. But now they want to test him out in the field. They heard that Leon himself is coming to Japan, where they're currently being held at, and Leon's been taking out many Foundation bases. They don't want this base to be taken out, so they want him to take Leon out. Not to really take him out, but mostly to test his abilities, if possible, to see if there's any adjustments that can be done to Midoriya. He has quite a unique amount of abilities that would make very, very many people jealous. But he also has this chip installed into his brain, so that he's forced to listen to any request that any Umbrella member would say. So when he was called in to go against Leon, he immediately accepted it. He found the location was in Central Park. He walked to Central Park by himself, and he saw Leon fighting off a nemesis. Leon had finally won because he had his partners, Chris and Jill. They all took down the nemesis at the same time. It took all three of them, and Midoriya merely walked up towards them with an emotionless face. He was in the alleyway. Before he walked out of the alleyway, he ripped off his pinky, he threw it behind him, and then he walked towards them. And once they saw him, they said, "Hey kid, it's dangerous over here. We just took down this nemesis, but there might be more. We don't know if this area's infected yet." And Midoriya merely ran up to him with a smile on his face and really bright eyes and said, "Oh, you must be Leon. You're very famous. Can I have your autograph?" He pulls out his notebook and a pencil, and he asks for Leon to sign it. Leon says, "Oh, I'm quite famous, aren't I?" He grabs the notebook, he looks at Midoriya, he notices something off, but doesn't think too much into it. He starts to sign it, and Midoriya pulls out something out of his pocket. He pulls out a knife and starts to try to charge at Leon. He tries to stab at him, but Leon merely blocks his arm and grabs his wrist and twists it and says, "Kid, what are you doing?" And the kid ends up saying, "I'm just taking out a threat." And his eyes have umbrella symbols in them. And they already know that this is a bioweapon. Leon says, "Shit, they got another one." And he kicks Midoriya away. But it does nothing. It's supposed to kick him a few feet away, but all the kick does is just make him vomit out a little bit of blood. Midoriya merely punches Leon in the chest and sends him flying a few meters back. He runs into a tree, and the tree knocks over, and it falls on top of Leon. Leon's trying to pick up the tree, or trying to push it away from him. But Midoriya is running towards him at blinding speeds, and trying to charge at him with the knife. And once he's in front of Leon, he swings his knife downwards towards Leon's head. Chris shoots the knife out of Midoriya's hand, and Jill runs up towards him in the hand-to-hand combat. She starts punching with the right hook. Midoriya merely blocks it with his left hand, grabs her opposite arm, and twists it, and moves it behind her back, and holds her neck with the other hand, and says, "I have a hostage. If you don't put down your gun and kick it away, I will snap her neck." And right when he said this, when Chris was about to put down the gun, all of a sudden, everyone heard, "I am here!" And someone jumped down and landed right in front of Midoriya. And quickly, Midoriya noticed that Jill was gone, and he looked upwards to see All Might towering above him, punching down towards Midoriya. Midoriya merely dodged to the left, but the wind pressure still kicked him back. He was baffled by the power of this man with this golden hair. He was very, very shocked, to say the less, because not even nemesises that he had to fight as a test trial were this strong. They were more durable, that's for sure, because as soon as he looked at All Might, he could tell he was injured. He could tell where the injury was, too. So Midoriya merely said in his head, "I've got to use that to my advantage." He pulled out a knife out of his coat, out of his, suit, and he threw it directly towards All Might. All Might merely slaps it away, but didn't notice that there was a second one behind it. The second one lands right into his side, right where his injury was, and causes All Might to vomit up blood. And Midoriya, he looked away from Midoriya for a few seconds. Midoriya was already in front of him, and he punched where the knife was, making it go deeper, making All Might vomit up blood even more profusely. And as he tried to grab the knife to pull it out, Midoriya was trying to hammer it back in, but then Chris punches Midoriya directly in the face. Midoriya merely doesn't budge. All that happens is the punch is on Midoriya's cheek still. Midoriya merely turns to look at Chris, and right when he's turning, the the knuckles of Chris are being crushed because of Midoriya's turn of his head, and Chris didn't move his knuckles. His whole fingers are crushed. His knuckles are crushed. And he immediately punches Chris in the abdomen, punches him in the face, grabs his arm and twists it and makes him flip over. And in quick succession, grabs his knife from his coat pocket, from Chris's coat pocket, and stabs him directly in the chest, but doesn't stab deep enough. Chris grabs his hand right when he did this and twists it, making him drop the knife before he can plunge it deeper in. The knife is inside of Chris, but isn't all the way inside of his chest, not directly towards where his heart is. It's still causing a lot of pain and damage, but he'll survive, if he's lucky. While Leon has just gotten the tree off of him and starts charging at Midoriya, Midoriya merely looks at Leon and smiles, a sinister smile. And Leon's confused. But he starts to notice there's something behind Jill, and it's a creature that he really does not like. It's a parasite. It's a paragon. They're able to go inside of hosts. They're able to take over hosts and use them. He screams out to Jill, "Look behind you, Jill!" But it's too late. The parasite digs into Jill's head and starts to take control of Jill and starts charging at Leon. Leon is having to fight Jill, so Leon won't have any wiggle room to fight Midoriya or go after him currently. But All Might is still trying to go after Midoriya while Midoriya is slowly trying to walk away. Until Midoriya says, "Hey, All Might," or whoever you are. I believe you're All Might. I think I heard of a person known as All Might from the Umbrella Corporation. We've heard you've busted a lot of our bases, but look behind you. You might want to be more concerned about him. He's bleeding out on the ground. Are you gonna still try to catch me, or are you gonna actually save your fellow hero?" And as he said this, Chris just said, "No, go after him," until the similar creature that Leon encountered digs into Chris, and Chris starts screaming out in pain, and All Might looks behind him, and Midoriya flees. All Might notices that Chris is overrun by a parasite. It's going inside of his head, too. And Jill and Chris are now controlled by parasites. They're not too far gone yet. They have to fight them. While Midoriya is walking away, calmly, and fleeing the scene, he sees that there's a black Dodge Charger. He actually likes to look, so he opens the door by, ripping the door off. And he merely hot wires the car and takes off with it. Leon, who had just finished knocking out Jill via neck chop, ran towards where Midoriya was going, and then he sees that Midoriya was taking off with his Dodge Charger, and he's like, "Hey, not my damn car! Hey, come back here with that!" And he was screaming at Midoriya for taking off with his car. While Midoriya was driving off, he was smiling insanely. Midoriya doesn't really show emotion that much, but there's something different about this. He feels a thrill for some reason. Quite unorthodox, though, is what he's thinking. Maybe something might be wrong with him. He needs to check to the doctors again. As he drives away, All Might is still facing Chris. Chris is trying to stab All Might viciously with his knife, and All Might is dodging as fast as possible. But Chris, who has more combat experience, merely whips All Might's leg, and All Might falls to the ground because he's still in his weakened state. Because that stab did a lot more damage than he would want to admit. The stab weakened his strength to barely even a quarter of his original strength. Now he's very weakened to where that one sweep in the leg made him go back into his Small Might state, and made him very vulnerable. Chris was about to stab downwards until Leon grabbed his hand and twisted it, making him drop the knife until Chris merely kicked straight behind him, does a roundhouse kick from behind, and kicks Leon in the face. And Jill gets up, who has already gotten the parasite removed by Leon. Leon has already figured out how to remove parasites now, before it can kill the victim, but it has to be recently. And Chris is running out of time, so Jill and Leon try to charge at Chris. Chris merely gets in a stance and blocks every single one of Leon's advances and counters Jill's. Jill's getting kicked in the abdomen, Leon's getting punched in the face, and his moves are being blocked. And Small Might is rushing up behind Chris and merely gets slapped in the face. And Chris has a surge of power because of the parasites and amplifying it by amplifying his blood cells, and his survival or flight or fight response is being amplified, making him a lot stronger than usual. Leon runs up towards him and pretends to punch him, but does a feint. When Chris is about to block it and doesn't notice it's a feint yet, Leon swoops his leg, makes him fall to the ground, and punches him straight in the face before he can land all the way to the ground, making his head hit the ground with a huge impact. And Chris is about to get back up and still has the parasite in before Jill pins him down, Small Might pins him down, and Leon pins him down, and they surgically remove the parasite. While all this is happening, Midoriya has now made it towards the Umbrella Corporation, which it's in an actual grassy field, and it's under a certain cellar. It's under a certain trap door in the field. When Midoriya pulls the trap door lever, the entire Umbrella Corporation rises from the ground, and he merely drives his car in through the front gates. And the guards don't really think much of it, but the scientists are fascinated that he brought something with him. He never brings anything with him, usually, except for the heads of his enemies. And while Midoriya is walking around the corporation, he's wondering what exactly to do. Because while he was driving, he was thinking about things that were not in his mission program. But he has a feeling that he needs to investigate this by himself and not tell anyone. And that's where I'm going to end What If Deku Was a Bioweapon Part